They thought they had all the power. They thought no one would fight back. But when they sent a K-9 unit to my house over a simple gate, they had no idea they were about to take on the most powerful man in the state. I had followed every rule. I checked the bylaws, got the permits, and even made sure my gate matched the neighborhood style. But none of that mattered to Mr. Peterson, the HOA's self-proclaimed enforcer. She decided I had violated the spirit of the community. It started with passive-aggressive notes, then the fake violations. But what happened next? Sending armed private security with a K-9 unit to my house. That is when things went too far. The real problem? They had no idea who they were messing with, because when that so-called HOA enforcement officer pounded on my door, threatening to take action, they were seconds away from learning a brutal lesson. You do not impersonate law enforcement. In front of the chief of police's house, I stepped outside, phone recording, as my dad's police cruiser pulled up behind them. "Oh, you want to play authority? Let's see how that works out for you. What would you do if your HOA sent a private army to your door? Stick around, because this is how you take down a corrupt HOA the right way." It all started with a simple black metal gate. The kind that slides open smoothly when you press a button. I had saved up for months to install it, mainly because people kept using my driveway as a turnaround point, leaving tire marks everywhere. My dad, being the chief of police, always taught me to handle problems the right way. So I did my homework. I checked every HOA bylaw, filed the necessary paperwork, got the permits, and even made sure the design matched the neighborhood aesthetic. But none of that mattered to Mr. Peterson. The first time I noticed something strange, I was watering my plants. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her standing there. Stiff posture, phone raised like she was documenting a crime scene. She did not even try to hide it. When I waved and asked if everything was okay, she just let out an exaggerated huff and speed walked back to her house. Her designer sneakers clicked against the pavement, a sound I would soon learn to despise. The next morning, a bright yellow violation notice was stuck to my mailbox. Urgent unauthorized modification, HOA violation. My gate had been up for less than 48 hours, and already Mr. Peterson was on the attack. I tried the reasonable approach first. That evening I walked to her house, approval papers in one hand, a batch of homemade cookies in the other, my mom's classic peace offering. But before I could even ring the doorbell, her security camera crackled to life. "I'm documenting everything." Her voice blared through the speaker. "That gate is reducing our property values. The HOA board will hear about this at tomorrow's emergency meeting." An emergency meeting? Over a gate? I called my dad, who was away at a police conference in Denver. "Just keep your cool," he said. "Document everything. Peterson has been pulling stunts like this for years. Remember when she tried to fine the Johnsons for having a basketball hoop?" But I had no idea just how far she was willing to go. That night my security camera pinged. Mr. Peterson was back, but she was not alone. 2 other HOA board members stood beside her, measuring my driveway, in the dark with flashlights. They whispered and pointed, probably plotting their next move. I hit record on my phone, trying not to laugh at how ridiculous they looked, skulking around with their measuring tape. But then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In Mr. Peterson's hand was a business card for Elite HOA Enforcement Solutions. I zoomed in on my security footage and Googled the company. What I found sent chills down my spine. They were a private security firm with a history of aggressive tactics, and they had their own K-9 unit. My phone buzzed. A new text message. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp, attendance mandatory. Bring your checkbook. Fines start at $500 per day." I looked out my window at the gate I had worked so hard to install. It stood there, gleaming under the streetlights, perfectly aligned, with all the HOA guidelines. What I did not know was that this gate was about to become the center of a neighborhood war. And Mr. Peterson, she had no idea who she was really messing with. The moment I stepped into the community center, it felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. The room was packed, more neighbors than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting before. Mr. Peterson stood at the front, radiating authority, with a PowerPoint presentation titled, "The Decline of Our Community Standards," glowing behind her. I already knew this was not going to be a fair discussion. She had set the stage, and I was the villain in her carefully crafted narrative. The first slide clicked on. My gate, heavily edited to look dark, almost menacing, like some kind of fortress, blocking the entire street. She turned to the room, her voice thick with exaggerated concern, warning everyone that this was only the beginning. If the HOA did not act now, soon people would be painting their houses neon green and turning their front yards into car junkyards. Murmurs spread through the room. She was playing to their fears, manufacturing a crisis that did not exist. I stood, calmly holding my HOA-approved paperwork. The moment I spoke, the room fell into a tense silence. I laid out the exact bylaw that permitted my gate, emphasizing that it was well within the legal height and matched the house's exterior. A few board members exchanged awkward glances. They knew I was right. But Mr. Peterson was not the kind of person to back down just because she had been proven wrong. Her expression hardened as she reached for a thick folder, claiming that she had documented nearly 40 separate instances of my gate disrupting the neighborhood. Reflections from headlights, the sound of the motor, even imaginary squeaks from the metal. She passed around photos, some taken in the middle of the night, time-stamped like crime scene evidence. I pulled out my phone and played a video of her sprinklers running at full blast at 3 a.m, water splashing onto my driveway. A few neighbors chuckled. She was losing her grip, and she knew it. But she had one final card to play. The announcement came with a smirk. The board had already voted. They had hired a private security firm to enforce community rules, an elite HOA enforcement team. The name sent a chill down my spine. I had heard of them before. West Valley Security Services. A neighbor confirmed my fears, whispering that they were serious professionals, complete with patrol cars, uniforms, and even K-9 units. I could barely believe what I was hearing. A professional security force for an automatic gate. As the meeting ended, I could feel the shift. The neighborhood was divided. Some people whispered in agreement with Mr. Peterson. Others looked uneasy, realizing how extreme this had become. I drove home, trying to convince myself that this was just another one of her power trips, that she would eventually back down, like she had before. But the moment I pulled into my driveway, I saw the tire tracks. The porch light cast a shadow over the small white business card tucked into my doorframe. I picked it up, my fingers tightening around the edges as I read the bold lettering. West Valley Security Services, HOA Enforcement Division. On the back, a message had been scrawled in black ink. First warning. I turned off my porch light and checked my security footage. The grainy video showed a black SUV pulling up at 1:30 a.m. A man in a tactical vest stepped out, walked straight to my door, and slipped the card into the frame. But he did not leave. He stood there, looking directly into the camera for nearly a full minute before finally turning back to his vehicle. And then he smiled. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I heard it. A deep, guttural growl. Not just any bark, the kind that came from a trained K-9. My hands tightened around the mug as I peeked through the blinds. 3 black SUVs with scythe HOA enforcement painted on the sides had surrounded my driveway. Mr. Peterson stood confidently at the front, phone raised, recording everything. A German shepherd strained at its leash, teeth bared. The man in the tactical vest from my security footage stepped forward, his voice sharp as he issued the final warning. The gate had to come down within the next hour, or they would be forced to take action. The dog lunged forward, and I stumbled back from the window. This was no longer just an HOA dispute. This was a full-blown siege. Something felt off about the entire situation. My instincts told me to look closer, so I grabbed my phone and zoomed in on the security badges attached to their uniforms. The metal did not catch the sunlight the way it should have. It looked cheap, fake. My stomach twisted. I hurried to my laptop, opening the county's security contractor database and typing in the company's name. What I found sent a wave of cold dread through me. West Valley Security Services was not licensed for K-9 operations. In fact, there were no registered private security firms in the entire district authorized to operate with police-trained dogs. They were bluffing. The pounding on my front door grew louder, their threats more aggressive. They warned that I had only minutes left before they released the dog. I could hear Mr. Peterson's voice in the background, thrilled at the spectacle she had created. My security cameras captured neighbors stepping out onto their lawns, whispering, some pulling out their phones to record. I knew I needed to act. Fast. I grabbed my files, the property maps I had printed weeks ago when this battle first started. I dialed my dad's number, praying he would pick up, even though I knew he was supposed to be 3 states away at that conference. The moment he answered, I could hear the change in his tone, the way his voice sharpened when I told him exactly what was happening. The K-9 handler was unclipping the dog's leash when I heard it, the deep, familiar rumble of a police cruiser, pulling onto my street. Mr. Peterson was too caught up in recording her victory to notice. But the fake security officers? They froze. The police lights flashed against the black SUVs. The loudspeaker crackled to life, and my dad's voice rang. Out, cutting through the morning air. This is Chief Williams. All unauthorized security personnel, stand down immediately. Everything shifted in an instant. Mr. Peterson spun around, her phone slipping from her fingers as she realized who had just arrived. The K-9 sat down on command, trained well enough to recognize real authority. The security officers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. For the first time, they were no longer in control. I stepped out onto my porch, phone still recording. I had everything I needed. Every threat, every violation, every moment of their manufactured intimidation, documented. The pieces were all coming together, and I was about to pull the final thread that would unravel the entire corrupt scheme. But this was just the beginning. The real investigation had only just begun. The street had never been so silent. The flashing police lights bathed the entire neighborhood in red and blue, casting long shadows against the pristine lawns and well-kept houses. Mr. Peterson stood frozen, her phone hanging loosely in her hand, her confident smirk replaced with something resembling fear. The so-called security officers hesitated, their false authority crumbling in real time. The K-9 handler, who had been moments away from releasing the dog, clenched his jaw as he glanced at the flashing lights behind him. My dad stepped out of his cruiser, uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the rising sun. He had dealt with all kinds of criminals, scammers, organized crime, people who thought they were untouchable. But there was something particularly irritating about those who pretended to have power they did not actually possess. He looked directly at the security officers, his voice cutting through the air with a tone that was impossible to ignore. Let me see your security licenses. Now. One of the so-called officers hesitated. The others looked at each other, waiting for someone to speak. That was all the confirmation my dad needed. He turned his attention to the K-9 handler. That dog, where was it trained? Who authorized its use for private enforcement? The man's mouth opened, then shut. Mr. Peterson, still standing in stunned silence, suddenly snapped out of it. This is just a misunderstanding, she blurted, her voice lacking the confidence it usually carried. We were only ensuring community compliance. This is standard HOA procedure. My dad raised an eyebrow. Standard procedure? Hiring an unlicensed security firm, issuing illegal threats, impersonating law enforcement. He gestured to my security cameras. We have footage, and I am sure my son is not the only one who recorded what just happened. A quick glance confirmed it. Several neighbors stood on their porches, phones raised, capturing every second of the humiliation unfolding before them. I stepped forward, my phone still recording. Mr. Peterson, I believe you and your hired enforcement team are in violation of county law, impersonating law enforcement, attempting to enforce fraudulent fines, and operating an unlicensed K-9 unit. "Would you like to see the documentation?" Her face drained of color. My dad turned back to the security officers. "Drop your radios. Hands where I can see them." The men hesitated for a moment before reluctantly complying. 2 additional police cruisers pulled up behind my dad, and within seconds, real officers were stepping out, taking control of the situation. One by one, the fake officers were questioned. Their badges were confiscated. Their radios, props, nothing connected to any actual dispatch, were handed over. The K-9 handler was taken aside, his dog loaded into an animal control vehicle. It was happening so fast that Mr. Peterson could barely keep up, her eyes darting back and forth as the security force she had so proudly flaunted was dismantled before her very eyes. This isn't necessary," she stammered. "I was only trying to do what was best for the neighborhood." Dad folded his arms. What's best for the neighborhood? Harassing homeowners, abusing power, and hiring unlicensed security? To intimidate residents? His voice was dangerously calm. "Because that sounds more like organized harassment than community service." I stepped closer. "I wonder, what would happen if the HOA's finances were audited? If someone looked into all the fines you've been handing out? If people checked where all that money was actually going?" She flinched. There it was, the crack in her armor. Because this wasn't just about my gate. It was about control, power, money. The HOA had been issuing fines for years. Ridiculous. Fees for everything from mailbox colors to lawn decorations. Nobody had questioned it. Nobody had pushed back hard enough. Until now. I pulled out my laptop, the files already pulled up. "Funny thing, Mr. Peterson. I did some digging, and it turns out that West Valley Security Services isn't just unlicensed. They have a history. Multiple complaints across different neighborhoods. You knew that, didn't you?" She shook her head, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. I turned my laptop toward my dad. "Here. 3 separate HOA communities reported them for harassment, illegal threats, and fraudulent fines. And guess who was on the HOA board of all 3 neighborhoods before she mysteriously moved to ours?" The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors exchanged glances. Some whispered among themselves. Others simply stared at Mr. Peterson, realization settling in. My dad exhaled sharply. "That's enough. Officers, bring her in for questioning. I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation." Mr. Peterson's mouth opened in protest, but no words came out. One of the officers gently guided her to the police cruiser, and for the first time, she did not have the authority to refuse. The neighborhood stood frozen, watching as she was led away, the weight of her crumbling empire finally sinking in. As the police secured the scene, I scrolled through my phone, already drafting the email to the state HOA Oversight Committee. This wasn't over. If Mr. Peterson had been pulling the same scam in multiple neighborhoods, then it was only a matter of time before a full-scale investigation was launched. I looked back at my gate, the same one she had spent weeks trying to destroy, now standing untouched, a symbol of what happens when you refuse to back down. One of my neighbors approached hesitantly, phone still in hand. You really took her down, huh?" I shrugged. "She did it to herself." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "About time." Others nodded, whispering about how they had been forced to pay unjust fines, how they had been afraid to speak up. That fear was gone now. The security SUVs were towed away. The fake officers disappeared, either arrested or quietly slipping into the background, hoping to avoid further legal trouble. As I stood there, watching everything unfold, I realized something. This wasn't just a victory for me. This was a turning point for the entire neighborhood. Because when one person stands up to corruption, it gives others the courage to do the same. And this was only the beginning. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick with the realization that everything Mr. Peterson had built was crumbling before her very eyes. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers painted a scene of absolute humiliation. The self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood, the woman who had rallied against my gate with such relentless arrogance, now stood frozen as officers secured the so-called security team, their radios and fake badges confiscated one by one. Mr. Peterson took a step back, shaking her head, still clinging to the belief that she could somehow twist the situation in her favor. "This is all a mistake," she stammered, forcing a nervous chuckle. "I was only trying to protect the integrity of our community." My dad, standing firm with his arms crossed, wasn't buying a word of it. By hiring unlicensed security to harass homeowners? By issuing fake violations and threats? His voice was steady, calm, but there was an edge to it that meant the conversation was over. The neighbors who had once nodded along with her rules and regulations now stood in clusters, whispering. Some looked at their phones, likely scrolling through the footage they had recorded, processing just how deep this scandal ran. Others looked at each other, guilt flickering across their faces as they realized they had been complicit in her manufactured reign of power. A few HOA board members, the same ones who had backed her through every outrageous fine and unfair regulation, were slowly stepping away, as if trying to distance themselves from the fallout. Mr. Peterson glanced at them, as if expecting someone to defend her. But no, one spoke. Silence. And then the dam broke. A voice cut through the thick tension. Bob from 2 doors down, the same guy who had nervously vouched for the security firm at the HOA meeting. "You told us this was legal," he said, eyes narrowing. "You made us believe this was for the good of the neighborhood." A woman from the back, arms crossed, scoffed. "You tried to fine my kid for drawing chalk on the sidewalk. You said it violated aesthetic consistency." Someone else added, "You made me repaint my door twice in 1 year. You said the color wasn't HOA approved, but you never refunded my fees." More voices, more stories. People who had been too afraid to push back, too worried about their standing in the community, were now speaking freely. The officers finished taking statements, and my dad stepped forward. "The State HOA Oversight Committee will be conducting a full investigation. But let me make one thing clear. This kind of abuse of power doesn't go unnoticed forever." Mr. Peterson let out a breathless laugh, still desperate to regain control. "You can't just—" But the sound of a police radio cut her off. An officer turned to my dad and nodded. "We have confirmation. Several formal complaints against this HOA were already under review. And now, with this new evidence, we're moving forward." The reality of it finally settled in. For the first time, Mr. Peterson looked small. She had spent years using fear and intimidation to keep the community under her thumb. But standing there, exposed, without her fake authority or a board willing to back her up, she was just another person caught abusing power. Her shoulders straightened. One last attempt to maintain the illusion of control. "I'll step down," she said finally, forcing an air of dignity. "It's clear this community doesn't appreciate my leadership." No one argued. The crowd parted as she turned, walking away with whatever pride she had left. But before she disappeared, she stopped in front of my house, staring at the gate that had started it all. She shook her head, let out a humorless chuckle, then kept walking. One by one, the remaining HOA board members announced their resignations. Without Peterson, without their so-called enforcers, they had nothing left to hold on to. I took in the scene, neighbors talking to each other like they hadn't in years. The fear that had kept them in check finally lifted. My dad turned to me, his voice softer now. "You did good, kid." I exhaled, the weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying finally lifting. "Yeah," I said, glancing at my gate. "Guess I did." But the best part? This wasn't just about my gate anymore. This was about taking back the neighborhood. The days that followed felt like a complete shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. The fear and tension that had once lingered like an unspoken rule were gone, replaced by something that had been missing for a long time: relief. Mr. Peterson had officially resigned from the HOA, and within a week she had packed up and moved out. No farewell messages, no final attempts at control, just a quiet exit, as if she had never been there. But her legacy of intimidation did not disappear overnight. The State HOA Oversight Committee launched a full-scale investigation, not just into our neighborhood, but into several others where similar patterns of abuse had surfaced. Her name was now attached to more than one HOA scandal, and whatever power she had once wielded was officially gone. With the old board dissolved, a new election was held, and this time, the candidates were people who actually cared about the community, not about controlling it. The ridiculous fines disappeared, the overreaching rules were rewritten, and for the first time, the HOA became what it was supposed to be: a system designed to support the neighborhood, not rule over it. Neighbors who had been too scared to speak up before were finally talking, sharing their experiences, reconnecting in a way that had not happened in years. Some admitted they had gone along with Peterson's demands out of fear of retaliation, others simply because they had assumed it was just the way things worked. Now, with the weight of that control lifted, they were able to breathe again. One afternoon, I was outside adjusting the settings on my automatic gate when I noticed something strange. A woman, someone new to the neighborhood, was standing across the street, looking up at my house. She had a phone in her hand, but she wasn't taking pictures like Mr. Peterson used to. Instead, she was scrolling through what looked like a website. Curious, I walked over. "Can I help you?" She smiled, a little embarrassed. "Oh, sorry. I was just looking up gate installation companies. I just moved into Peterson's old place and, well, I was thinking about adding one." I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I just nodded. "Yeah, I'd recommend a good one." For the first time in weeks, I realized that I didn't have to be on edge anymore. The fight was over, and we had won. As I walked back inside, I took one last glance at my gate, the same, one that had started a war. Now, it stood not as a symbol of division, but of what happens when people stand their ground against abuse of power. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's watching the people who tried to control you realize they were wrong, too. Late to do anything about it. If you have ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, you know how frustrating it can be when people in power abuse their authority. Have you ever been hit with ridiculous fines, forced to change something on your property, or dealt with a neighbor who thinks they own the whole street? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. This story proves that standing up to corruption works. But it also raises an even bigger question. How many other neighborhoods are dealing with HOA abuse right now? This was just one community, one corrupt board, but imagine how many more are out there getting away with the same tactics. If you think this was crazy, wait until you hear about the HOA that tried to take a family's home over a $50 fine. Yes, you heard that right. A single missing payment nearly cost them everything. Click here to watch that story next. You won't believe how it ends. And if you enjoy stories about standing up against injustice, exposing corruption, and watching karma do its job, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are plenty more HOA nightmares out there, and trust me, some are even worse than this one.